Okay, so I'll just be super quick. Okay, so it looks like we are good. So remember, the Nile River is important for Egypt. Okay? Just like with Mesopotamia, the biome of Egypt is a
desert.
The biome of Egypt is a
Desert.
desert. So all that stuff we learned about Mesopotamia and why people were able to live there is going to be the same for Egypt. Remember, do you get enough rain in a desert to grow crops? Yes or no?
No.
No, you don't. Is there enough fertile soil in a desert to grow crops? No. So, just like with the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, we automatically know if you ever see a desert and there's a civilization there, you automatically have to know there's going to be a big river and that river is going to flood. Because if those two things don't happen in a desert, there's not enough water to grow crops and there's not enough soil to plant crops. So, for the Nile River, it was super important for the people who lived there. So our next slide, Miss Briz, would you mind reading this one since I've been yapping a lot here?
Okay, so Upper Egypt refers to the southern part of Egypt, which is upstream of the Nile River. Here, the Nile is more narrow and surrounded by more caves.
Thank you. So please go ahead and get this typed into your grapes chart. This should be, I guess it would probably be what, number 4?
Yeah.
Yep. Okay. So, if you have been paying attention and kind of looking at some of the stuff that you read, this whole thing with Upper Egypt kind of doesn't make sense. Because if you look at the map here, and you can look at either one, doesn't really matter. But notice, Lower Egypt is up north, and Upper Egypt is down south. That seems kind of weird, doesn't it?
Yeah.
It seems like if you're looking at a map, Upper Egypt should be here, and Lower Egypt should be here, right? But if we look at what we highlighted, there's a very important word, upstream. So really, even though, the earth isn't flat, but it's on a plane, right? So the earth is on a plane. So really, it doesn't go up and down like this. You can think of it as being more on a plane, right? And so if you look at what's going on with our map, you've got Upper Egypt, Lower Egypt. Can everybody kind of see that?
Yeah.
Now, if it says that it's upstream, that actually means that it's not flat. So Upper Egypt is actually at a higher elevation than Lower Egypt. So you see how our map is kind of bent, and you see how the river kind of goes downhill like that? See that?
Yeah.
This is why Upper Egypt looks like it's below Lower Egypt. Okay? Because when you take that map and put it on a flat paper map, now it's further down. But in real life, you've got elevation and it's actually taller, and the Nile River actually goes downhill. Does that difference make sense?
Yeah.
Because that's super duper important. So the Nile River goes downhill. That's where we get the Upper Nile. Okay? And if we have the Upper Nile, what else are we going to have?
Lower.
You're going to have the lower part of Egypt, the Lower Egypt. Okay? So Lower Egypt refers to the northern part of Egypt, which is downstream of the Nile. Here the river slows down and widens, and eventually it fans out into multiple channels leading toward the sea. That increases the amount of farmland. So, before you start typing, let me show you on the map again real quick. So remember how Upper Egypt was taller, it was up higher than Lower Egypt. Remember that? So you see how on the map where Lower Egypt is, it's flat? So that's what happens in real life too. So as the river is going downhill, the water's moving faster because it's got gravity helping, right? It's got some newtons of force behind it. Shout out to Miss Platt. Once it gets to where it starts to flatten out, what's going to happen to this water that was going downhill once it gets to this flat part here? What's that water going to do? It's going to slow down and stop. And as that water slows down and stops, well, that's what causes our delta. So I'm going to move our computer back so you can see what I'm getting ready to draw on the screen. And while I'm doing that, go ahead and get your stuff that's highlighted into your pink box in your grapes chart. Explain this really quickly. So, like we've been talking about, and you should understand this fully by now, okay? The only reason people are able to live here is because the Nile River floods. You remember how when I was showing you the map, we saw how once it gets downhill, it gets to the bottom, it gets really flat? So what happens is, well, if you were to guess, where does Egypt start to get flat? Come right on the board where you think it starts to get flat.
I would have to guess probably somewhere around here.
Maybe around there? Do you have a guess? You can come and guess too.
I would say from the map, it looks like it starts right here. See that?
Okay. All right. So you see it starts to get flat there. Where do you think? Okay. Awesome. We've got some good guesses. So we kind of see where it goes flat. And maybe I was a bad teacher. I should have asked, where does it go super flat? Kind of like Minecraft. Right? So, where does it go super flat? Why do you say that's where it goes super flat, sir?
Because it's like fertile land and it's easier to get in that area.
Yeah, so we kind of see some of the spots where it starts to flatten out. And here's the thing. If you were one of the people that guessed it here or here, you're not wrong. Because remember we learned about the cataracts that we read about? So, you're not wrong. This is where it starts to, there's dips in elevations and drops in elevations. Right about here is where it starts to get super flat, and you can tell because the river slows down, and then you start to see the river spreading out, right? You can see kind of the paths that the river takes once it slows down. Yes, sir?
Is that blue spot the river, or is that...
This?
Yeah.
So this blue spot, remember, we're zoomed in. Here's a hint. This is the Mediterranean Sea. We learned that there were two big bodies of water. So what would this be part of? Red Sea. So the Red Sea would continue on kind of like that and then go down. So this is part of the Red Sea. This is the Nile River. Now, why is it green instead of blue? Because this is a part of the year where the crops are. So people are growing crops there so you can't see the water as well. Okay? Awesome. So I'm going to be kind of quick. Just a sec. Or yes, sir.
Oh, so they would basically sometimes put their crops like on top of the water.
Not on top. Remember, it floods. And so where the river is, the crops have grown so much that you can't really see where the river goes through. Because remember, this is a satellite image taken from space. Okay? All right. So on the banks of the Nile River lies fertile, dark soil. This soil was so important to the Egyptians that they called their land Kemet, which means the Black Land. This black land is a result of silt flooding caused by heavy rainfalls in East Africa. So one of the things that we have to remember is that if it wasn't for the Nile River flooding, people would not be able to grow crops in Egypt. Just like if it wasn't for the Tigris and Euphrates flooding, people wouldn't be able to grow crops in Mesopotamia. So the Egyptians understood this and knew this. And if we could invent a time machine and go back to ancient Egypt, when we got there, they wouldn't welcome us by saying, "Welcome to Egypt." They would say, "Welcome to Kemet." And Kemet is really like literally means silt or black land. So it was so important to them, that's what they called themselves. They didn't call themselves Egyptians back then. They called themselves Kemet, or the land of Kemet, or the people of Kemet. It would be like in the United States today if we called ourselves the Silt Nation, right? It was so important to them that that's what they named themselves. They named themselves after the black land. And like we've learned before, the river flooding has to come from something. Their river's flooding came from heavy rainfalls in East Africa on the Ethiopian plateau. So it wasn't necessarily snow like it was snow melting in mountains, it was rain in mountains. And we have the Red Land too. So the Red Land is the inhospitable desert which surrounds the Nile and the Black Land. The Red Land acts as a barrier for both entering and leaving Egypt. It is the source for most of Egypt's non-agricultural resources like stone or metals. So, since we know that Egypt is a desert, their desert sand was not brown. It was actually kind of reddish because it had like copper and rust in it. So their sand was red. So they called it the Red Land. The Black Land was the silt where people could live and grow crops. The Red Land was the desert where people couldn't live. So the Red Land was super important for two reasons. One, it was so huge that people couldn't cross the desert to come and attack them. So Egyptians were pretty safe. They didn't have to worry about tons of people attacking them from land because it was so hard to cross the desert. But it also made it hard to get out of Egypt, and it made trading a little harder too. And so because people couldn't go across the desert, the way they could trade was by using ships on the Nile River. So I'm going to kind of show you what that looks like over here so we can kind of see what I'm talking about. Okay, so I went ahead and turned the lights on so you could kind of see what we're talking about here. So if you imagine the way that it looked, you had the Nile River, and the Nile River kind of went through Egypt, right? And because the Nile River floods, you have silt on either side of the Nile River. And remember, if the Nile River didn't flood, then you wouldn't have this black land. You wouldn't have this. It would all be red land desert. But because the Nile River does flood, you do get silt and you do get some of the black land to grow crops. And then wherever the flooding stopped, from there on out is red land, which is very dangerous, very deadly desert. So the Nile River is the reason that there's black land, and then the red land was a desert that was all around it.